Hello and welcome to lecture number 3, which is actually lecture number 2 over chapter number 3. It's confusing, but eventually you'll get with it. We're going to be talking about a really key element of small group communication, and I say that it's a key element because it's really the framework by which we understand how small groups really work. We talked about communication processes, and we're going to talk more about communication processes. We've defined groups, but we really need to know how to look at groups, how to analyze groups, and how to understand groups. So the chapter is titled The Small Group as a System, which at first glance seems pretty simple, and it is, but it's also fairly complex. So today we're going to really spend some time talking about systems theory, and we're going to talk more about it in class too, so we can understand it very well. So, like I said, this is one way to understand groups and small group communication. I want to stress that it is not the way, and it is not the only way. There are dozens of ways to understand how we interact in small groups, but most of us take this perspective. There are faults with it, but I think in general it's one of the most easy to understand. It makes the most sense, and it really does apply. You're going to see a lot of these applications as you start to work with your group. So, like I said, this is the systems perspective, and it looks at groups as systems. That they are entities made up of various components in interdependent relationships to each other. They require constant adaptation among its parts or its members to maintain what we call organic wholeness and balance. And really that just means success. So think about it this way. We have a group. Let's take an organization, a group of people, a group of coworkers, and they work really well together, right? They're all on the same page, which is why all these people on the screen look the same way. But organizations are flexible. People come and people go. So when new people come, adaptations have to be made. The new people are going to have to adapt to group culture, to the system, so to speak. Eventually they do, and they all get on the same page. They become interdependent, which means again, that they're all on the same page, they're all working for the same goal. So there's an adaptation period, but we're not going to spend too much time on that. We're going to talk more about interdependence, what it actually looks like when that adaptation happens. So let's talk about interdependence. Not a confusing concept at all. Here's the definition. It's the property of a system such that all parts are interrelated and affect each other as well as the whole system. Here's the basic idea, that one part of the system is really no better than any other part of the system, because if one part is missing, whether it's a small part or a big part, if one of them stops working, the rest of the system is going to fall apart. That each person or each group or each cluster in an organization has some value, and without the value that they contribute, the rest of the organization cannot continue on. Let's look at this in real life, okay? Which cartoon version of real life here, but let's look at it in the context of a car crash, right? Let's assume you had a very safe car crash, you wrecked into a tree, you're fine. But when you have a car crash, we really can see the system's perspective come into play, right? First person that arrives on the scene are the firemen, the police, the safety officials, right? There might be paramedics that come and take care of you to make sure that your body is okay after such impact of force of hitting a tree. Then you've got the drivers of the ambulance who take you to the hospital and make sure that you're okay to get checked out by a doctor, right? So we see that each one of these people has a unique role. They all do something completely different. They have their own function, but really your life depends on them working together as a system. If the fireman didn't show up to help cut you out of the car, then the paramedic's job would be null and void. He wouldn't be able to do it. But if there wasn't an ambulance driver, the doctor wouldn't be able to do his job. So the doctor's job depends on the success of the ambulance driver. The ambulance driver depends on the success of the paramedic able to get you into the ambulance. The paramedic's success depends on the fireman's ability to get you out of the car. Really, these all work together. They're interdependent. And that brings up a principle, and we call this the principle of non-summativity. This is a really key element. Make sure you get this. And the idea is this. It's the property of a system that the whole is not the sum of its parts, but may be greater or less than the sum. So it's not 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 4. Really, the sum of these parts is much greater because they're able to do great things based on their interdependent relationship with each other. We see this a lot in group relationships. Let's take KU basketball, for example. We are proud of our team. Now, I know that there are players that really stick out in this team, but as a whole, it's the team that's successful. There are great members. We've got Andrew Wiggins or Perry Ellis. What would happen if we took them out? Well, the team would be affected. What would happen if we took Bill Self out of the equation? Obviously, the team would be effective. But even if we put Bill Self, Perry Ellis, and Andrew Wiggins together, as talented as those three are, they still would not have the power that the team has, because the team as a whole working unit is interdependent. There are small nuances and strengths that each individual brings to the team that impact their overall success. Really, it's about everybody working together. Now, this brings up two key economic principles related to communicating in small groups. First is the principle of multifinality. So multifinality is simply this. It's a principle related to systems theory that says systems that start out at the same place can reach different goals and likely will reach different goals. Let's put this in the context of this class. We are all starting out here, right? We've all received the same training from Rachel at the Guy Doogie Center. You've all been given the same assignment, but likely you're all going to have different end goals and different end success. Some of you are going to raise $5,000. Some of you are going to raise $3,000. Some of you are going to raise $600. Different ends, broadly speaking, end goals and end results, even though we've all started at the same place. On the flip side, we have the principle of equifinality, which is just the opposite. It says that different systems can reach the same end point. So, making it applicable to this class, we're all on the same page here. This class is raising money for the Guy Doogie Center, which we'll situate in this white box. But you're likely not the only one that's contributing financials to the Guy Doogie Center, right? There might be other groups in the community that have different goals and have different systems and have started at different places but are contributing to the same end goal as you. So these two principles kind of exist in opposite of each other, but they're both related to another principle of systems theory, and that is the principle of multiple causation. Now, don't get burned out on the language related to statistics and research design here, but it is really applicable. And the basic idea behind multiple causation is this, that each change in a system is really caused by numerous factors. So let's start down here at the end. The end goal, the successful outcome, or the successful communication change. Let's assume that maybe there are two key things that have really contributed to this organizational change. Or taking it one step further, let's assume that there are two key groups that have really worked together to help have this successful outcome. Now, we acknowledge that these groups have done great things, but really it's not just those groups or teams that facilitated this change, right? There were multiple variables behind the scenes. Those variables could be anything. They could be individuals in those groups' previous experience. It could be their personality types. It could be their experience in the company, their background, their education, many other personal variables or reasons and influence on these two groups and their overall success. But even those variables have relationships with other variables, right? The way that the experience in the company interacts with your level of education, or the way that your personality interacts with your personal background. They interact. It's kind of a messy relationship between all of these. So we must recognize that these variables, these orange diamonds up here, are not static. They don't just exist apart from each other. They correlate with other variables, often in very messy ways. So here's where we see the principle of multiple causation. It's the idea that there are numerous correlated variables. So this is correlated with this, which is correlated with this. That creates a unique relationship, and those ultimately contribute to the greater things moving down the system and ultimately to successful organizational outcomes or organizational changes. Kind of complex. It's even a mouthful coming out of my mouth, but it's not that difficult to understand, especially when we have a good view of what a variable is. So let's explore that just a little bit further. Let's take away all these other things and talk just about variables. Now, you've likely heard the term variable before, but can you explain it? If you've taken a research methods course, especially if you've taken one in the Department of Communication, you should be able to explain what a variable is, but I'll define it just in case. And for the sake of this course, we'll define a variable relatively simply, and we'll define it as an observable characteristic or quality that can vary. So a lot of times we see variables in research, right? So here's a study, and these things in this orange box over here are what we would label as variables, okay? They are things that influence the overall outcome being measured. So this is a study that measures students' overall success. And so they measured individual variables, students' reading scores, their writing scores, their math scores, their science scores, and then gender. And this actually keeps going down, but we'll just take this brief snapshot. We assume that these variables might have some influence on the thing that we're trying to measure. So let's put it in an organizational context. We can assume, or we might presume, that a group's overall success is dependent on some variables. Individuals' moods during a meeting, their background, their status in the company, the change that's occurred in the company. There are many variables that influence overall outcomes. So again, think about those variables in terms of groups and teams. What might influence productivity? Moods. Let's move on and talk about moods. Times of day, the communication style of individuals in a group, the last meeting success, many other things. There are many variables, but there are also many different types of variables in the group process. And so I want to kind of break this down just a little bit more. So there are three key types of variables in the group communication process. We've got input variables, output variables, and throughput variables. And we're going to go through and cover these one by one so we don't get them confused. Let's first talk about input variables. These are relatively easy to understand. They are the energy, the information, the raw materials used by an open system. And we'll talk about open systems in a little bit, but used by a group, let's say, that are transformed into output. So in many ways, this is a group's manpower, or not to use gendered language, they're the group's people power, what they're able to do. They're the components from which a small group is formed and what they use to do what they're doing. Groups are made up strategically based on what individuals bring to the table, right? You have been put in groups, but think about any of the other groups you're a part of. Likely, any groups that have been formed for you were done strategically and specifically based on what you bring to the table, what other people bring to the table. Let's talk about some standards for input variables. We know that members should share basic beliefs and values about the purpose of a group. So when we think about the group as a whole and members as input variables, we know that they need to all be on the same page, right? They need to share the basic beliefs about the company or about the purpose of the group. Second, they should understand the group's purpose and accept it. You shouldn't have one member that's always trying to change the purpose of the group. Everybody, again, needs to be on that same page. Third, the number of members should be as small as possible, as long as the necessary variety of perspectives is represented. So in groups, we want as few members as we can possibly have, because again, going to a lecture that we're going to talk about in the future, the more people you add to the conversation, and I say conversation in a broader context, the more psychologically complex it is. Personalities are multidimensional, and the more personalities you add, the more potential for relationships and intergroup associations you have, which can complicate the situation. So you want as few members as possible, as long as you're getting the necessary variety of perspectives. I want you to also think broadly here about things like affirmative action. Why do we have rules in place for companies to have a specific set of diverse people working for them? Because we want to see that there's a necessary variety of perspectives represented, and we'll talk more about this in the future. Additionally, group members should know what the group's relationship is to their groups and organizations, and what resources they can count on from those groups and organizations. So know who's funneling you. You know that you're associated in this class with KU, the Department of Communication, and the Gadugi Safe Center. I would say those are our three big affiliations. So know the resources that those offer. Rachel's offered to be a resource for you. She's given you her number and her email address. I've offered to be a resource for you. KU has resources for you, broadly speaking, saying if you have a testing issue or certain anxieties or certain special needs, they have resources for you. Know your relationship to each one of those groups and organizations and what resources you can count on from them. And then know that you must have enough time to do your work. This is key. That's why we have many days built into the calendar that are days off for you in this course, because you need to have enough time to do your work in order to do it well. And then finally, the group's meeting place, whether you choose to meet physically or virtually, should be comfortable and allow for discussion in a pure sense, in a discussion that is free from distraction. All right? So these input variables contribute to throughput variables, which I think are a little easier to understand because really throughput variables are the group process. It's how the system or the group actually functions and how it transforms inputs into outputs. This is the middle ground. It is the process. So these can be many things like group behaviors, roles, status, power, conflict, cooperation, communication, networking, socialization, problem solving, decision making, taking action. It's everything that contributes to the process of the group, which is really where the project that we're doing this semester comes into play. It's more about the group process than it is anything. Yes, we're focused on the outcome, the output variables, but it's the throughput variables that teach us most about ourselves and about working in groups. Because there are many individual elements related to throughput, because we see that throughput is the process of putting individuals together in a group, we need to talk about ethics and what it means to be an ethical member through the throughput process. So here are some general rules and guidelines to get us through the ethics of throughput. First, members should be dependable and reliable. You are no longer a slave to yourself. You are a slave to your group. That means that you do not operate in a way that only brings glory or punishment to you. You operate in a way that brings glory or punishment to your group. If you don't show up to a meeting, your whole group suffers because, again, going back to systems theory, you are interdependent. You are valuable to your group, and when you don't contribute, that means you are contributing to the demise of your group. So be dependent and be reliable. Second, express yourself competently and considerately. Competently means this: say what you mean to say and say it well. And be considerate. Yes, it's important to say what you need to say, but do it in a way that validates other members and is respectful. Your role as a member should be relatively stable, understood, and accepted by all. You are naturally going to fall into a position in a group. You might be a leader, you might be a follower, you might be a supporter, you might be a distractor, you might be something and you will be something, but know that that role should stay pretty much the same. Now, if it's a negative role, we encourage you to change, but likely it won't. Know that members should have relatively equal status. Yes, there are leaders and followers and supporters and distractors, but everybody should have a relatively equal status. This is not a dictatorship. The leader should not just lead. Think of this as a cooperative democracy. And then know that norms and rules should be understood, followed, or discussed and challenged when they do not work. So really, this means that the norms that you establish as a group should function. They should be a normal thing. But when those norms are counter-effective, make sure that you discuss them and change them. And then know that communication should flow freely in all directions. Again, think of a cooperative democracy. Know that you should be completely comfortable talking to the leader about any concerns you have, and they should be completely comfortable talking to you. Know that procedures should be efficient, and all members should develop them. So when we think about the process or what the group does, all members should contribute to developing the procedures or the norms. Okay? So very, very simple. Now, let's talk briefly about outcome variables. Outcome variables are also quite simple, just like throughput variables. They are the success of the group. They're what's produced by a system or a group. Might be a tangible product, or it just might be a simple change in an organization. For you, the outcome variable is the money that you will raise for the Gadugi Safe Center. And really, the outcome is only really about the success or lack of success of the group. It's their final production, their final outcome. But when you have an outcome, you kind of also need to step back and evaluate if it's sufficient. So here are some steps for judging those outcome variables. As members, you should step back and perceive that the group's purpose has been achieved. At the end of the semester, you should be able to step back and say, we did it. We did what we set out to do. We were successful. You should have a sense of accomplishment. You as a personal member of the group should be satisfied with your respective role, your discussion in the group work process, and your relationship with other members. Really, you can judge an output variable by looking at members' individual happiness and success in the group. Members at the end of it all should feel like a cohesive unit. They should feel like they accomplished something, but that they accomplished something together, that they were a unit, and without other members of the unit, they would not have been as successful. The group's leadership should be stable and reliable. You should be confident enough in your leader to want to work with them again. And then the group should be a culture that reflects its unique qualities and values. As a group, you'll create a culture this semester. The group that you're working in will have different end goals, different processes, different narratives to tell us at the end of the semester from other groups. You're going to create a culture, and groups really are about rich culture. And then the parent organization, which in this case, one does exist, that's the Gadugi Center, should be strengthened as a result of your work. You should help them, not hurt them. And I trust that you all will. You all are a very competent bunch. You all are off to a great start. I know that you're going to help them a lot, and they're going to be very appreciative of your output variables. Now, this is a nice system, but we must recognize, like we talked about in the first lecture, that things don't happen in a vacuum, right? This is all nice, neat, and tidy, but it doesn't happen like this all the time. We have to consider context, and in any context, there are environmental variables that have an influence on the overall success or the overall system. And I think one of the biggest environmental variables that needs to be considered is if your group operates from an open systems perspective or a closed systems perspective. And we're not going to get too far into this. This is more theoretical than what we're going to focus on in this course, but it is a really important part of talking about systems theory. So I want to briefly define and explain what open systems and closed systems are. An open system is this. It's a system with relatively permeable boundaries, which produces a high degree of interchange between systems and their environments. So think of this course as an open system, right? You get information from me, you get information from each other, you get information from Rachel, you get information from people outside of this class. Really, there's a hodgepodge of influence here, and they all come from just different systems. And we totally accept that, and we welcome it. That's an open system, very permeable boundaries. I would argue that there is no such thing as a truly closed human system, but we can think in terms of closed systems by talking about systems like small groups with really impermeable boundaries, resulting in very little exchange of information between the system and its environment. I don't believe that there's a truly closed human system, but let's think of a monastery, right, where monks go to worship or stay. I don't really know what they do in a monastery, but this is the example the book uses, and it helped me understand closed systems even more. Monks are in a monastery. They associate with each other, but they have little outside interaction. There's not much influence of the outside world on what monks do on a daily basis, right? That's a closed system. So I think the best situation we can apply this to in an organization is breaking it down to the departmental level. So we think of the traditional team, which is what we have here on the left. We conceptualize these teams as really an open system. They're made up of people from various departments who work together for a common goal, right? They each bring a unique experience and a unique contribution to the group. Thinking in terms of closed systems, not that they are a completely closed system, but think of accountants, right? They're relatively fixed and stable. They don't rely on the norms and structures from outside of the department, right? These people have no dictation over what this guy does when he's crunching numbers. Again, it's not a truly closed system, but it's about as close as we can get to explain it in an organizational context. So, one of the key elements that really embodies open systems is feedback. Something that's really key here. And by definition, we define feedback as a response to a system's output. So it might come in the form of information or tangible resources, but really its goal is to help the system determine whether or not it needs to make adjustments in moving toward its goal. So feedback is what people give to the group, or what the group gives to itself, to continue to help it move towards its end goal. And really, if you think back to lecture 1, and then as we move into lecture number 3, you're going to see that feedback is an integral part of the basic communication transaction model. It's a crucial linkage between groups and their greater environment. So we think about just the basic communication interaction we have between Hillary Clinton and Ellen, which you saw in the last lecture. That's a transaction. There's feedback going on there. It's a crucial element, and we can't overlook it. And really, it's the environment that influences a group's success here. So that's why it's important to talk about those environmental considerations in order to foster effective group problem solving. So let's talk about some environmental considerations. And we think of environment as the company, right? So in an organizational context, the environment that groups operate in is the company. And so we see this exchange between the environment and the group, but how do we recognize what groups actually are? Well, we're going to talk about some of these environmental considerations and then move into what a group actually is. So here are some considerations that the environment must make. It should publicly recognize the accomplishments of the group and reward the group as a group, not as individuals. If the group is successful, the entire group needs to be recognized. Second, the environment should supply whatever resources the group needs. This says information resources, but I contend that it should be any resources that the group needs, because they might be social support resources, which are a very, very valuable part of being in a group. The environment should supply whatever resources and expertise the group needs. So here's where we see that come into play. Not just resource, but expertise, saying, hey, I've been in your shoes before, I know what to do, follow my advice. And then the environment should also provide a supportive atmosphere for the group. So kind of combining these three together, making sure that the group feels supported in its pursuit of its end goal. So again, we talked about how there's this exchange between the environment and the group, but how we recognize what groups actually are. How do you say that you're actually a real group? What makes you a real group? And this leads us to a discussion of the bona fide group perspective, which is a really, really key thing, especially in organizational communication. And it gives us some real guidelines, 2 real guidelines to determine if you actually are a real group. So there's 2 rules. Let's talk about the first one. Real groups, real bona fide groups, have stable yet permeable boundaries. So how they interact within those boundaries is largely up to them, and it is a cluster, and it can be messy, but in general there are boundaries. To be a member of a group, you need to fit within this blue circle. How you fit is up to interpretation, but you need to be a member of this circle. Second, we need to recognize that real groups are interdependent with their relevant context, which leads us to discussion on intergroup communication. Anybody that's taken intercultural communication classes knows that interpersonal communication and intergroup communication are very highly related. Intergroup communication is really all about our identities. So in any given group, assume this is a company group here, a group that works together in a company, we must recognize that these groups are made up of many sub-identities, right? So we've got gender, maybe, race, class, experience, I mean, on and on and on and on and on, right? Our groups are made up of many sub-identities. We have sub-identity allegiances, intergroup allegiances, which influence our thinking greatly, right? These are things that really, really dictate how we think. Men and women think differently. People from different socioeconomic classes think differently. People with different experience levels think differently. So yes, we're a group. Yes, there's a boundary. But again, how we interact within that boundary is largely left up to us, and it's influenced by these intergroup influences. Does all that make sense? Unless you can give me feedback through a video. But this is some complex things. These are very theoretically based applications, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page. We'll talk more about this in class. So one of the last things that I want to talk about is boundaries. This is where the book ends, and I think it's really, really important, especially when we have a conversation about intergroup allegiances and the role that intergroup alliances play in our group communication practices. So there are many boundaries. You know that groups have boundaries, but there's also different roles that we play in boundaries. So you might be part of a group of, 7 or 8 people. You might fall in just the general group, or you might be part of a more specific task force that's charged with leading the group. Or maybe you're this one person that oversees the entire group and reports to a higher authority. There are different boundaries even in a group. So we know that groups have boundaries so that you can't go outside of the group and still be in the group if you violate those boundaries, like we talked about a few slides ago. But there's also boundaries in groups. We know that leaders do and do not do certain things, that subordinates do and do not do certain things. We have various roles within the group, within the system, and that's important to recognize. This is something we're actually going to spend some time talking about in class, We're actually going to spend a lot of time talking about all these concepts because I will be the first to admit that these are semi-tricky to understand, and as somebody who's been teaching for years and years and years, I actually find these somewhat tricky to explain because they make sense, and oftentimes the concepts that make the most sense are the ones that are the hardest to actually understand, to put on paper, to get out in words. So as you're getting ready to start really delving into the group work process, you're going to see these, and that's what's really going to make them click for you, I think. You're going to see the systems perspective in action. I'm excited to see you actually get started working in your groups. It's coming very soon. I think that's when some of these things are really going to start to make sense, and it's going to get exciting. This is relatively boring, and I'll be the first to admit that, but it very, very, very much informs our thinking about groups, and it is so important to understand. So please bring any questions you have about systems theory to class. We're going to do some activities to help us understand it a little better. Make sure you create a study guide based not only on this lecture but also on the chapter. Submit it to SafeAssign. Have a fantastic, fantastic day. Thanks for watching and hearing my voice for a very long time, and I will see you soon in class.